Hello, welcome everyone for the January 2021 Research Showcase at the Wikimedia Foundation. Glad you're joining us for the first showcase of the year. My name is Martin Garch. I'm a research scientist here at the Wikimedia Foundation. I'm the host for today. We are excited to have Erin Shaw today to present. He's a professor at Northwestern University in the United States. He's a longtime researcher of Wikipedia specifically and peer production more generally. And he will present ongoing research from his group with the title, The Importance of Thinking Big, Convergence, Divergence, and Interdependence Among Wikis and Peer Production Communities. Before I hand it to Erin, I want to make two announcements. One is that after the presentation, we'll have plenty of time for an extended Q&A, as we only have one speaker today. So if you have questions for Erin, please put them in the chat or in IRC. My colleague Isaac Johnson will be monitoring the channels and relaying them in the discussion. The second announcement is related to the Wiki workshop, which is organized by my colleagues Miriam Redi, Leila Zia, and Bob West. It is happening in conjunction with the web conference at the end of April. And we are inviting you to submit your works. The deadline is approaching. It is January 29 for the archival submission. So please send us your work or tell us if you have further questions. With this, Erin, the floor is yours. Please go ahead with your talk.
Thank you so much, Martin. And thanks for inviting me and for hosting, and any of you who are joining, especially in the US at the moment, if you're joining despite the fact that there's a major presidential inauguration happening that you might have heard something about. So if I can, if we can get more viewers than the inauguration, I don't know what that says about American democracy, but so be it. Okay, I'm going to just make sure that I'm setting up the screen share here. We tested this.
This looks good.
Looks good. Okay, great. And I will just make sure that I'm looking at the version of it that I want to see. Okay, and the audio is still coming through okay, just double checking that as well.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you all again so much. And there are some other folks who I'll be acknowledging sort of during the course of this presentation. In particular, I just want to mention up front members of the Community Data Science Collective, which is the research group that I co-lead, which it spans a few different universities at this point and includes a number of PhD students, faculty, and fellow travelers in various places and time zones. And I also want to acknowledge that this work has really benefited from the support of a number of different institutional and other organizations, in particular the National Science Foundation of the United States, Northwestern and the University of Washington, and in many ways the Wikimedia Foundation and the communities that generate and provide and publish data resources and computational tools to analyze data sets of the community. So with that, I'll just kind of jump in here. And I've titled the talk, The Importance of Thinking Big, and that's an effort to just point to the idea that this is both a talk that's focused at what I'll call the kind of macro level of thinking about online communities and peer production and wikis and Wikimedia and Wikipedia communities. But it's also a talk that tries to synthesize across a few different lines of research within the Community Data Science Collective, and that really showcases some unpublished work that is being led by student members of the group right now. So I'm going to try to call out specific names and projects as we go, and I'm happy to take questions about it, but I'm also going to be a little bit shy about sharing certain aspects of it, since all of the new work that I'll mention is unpublished, and I don't want to sort of steal the thunder of the students who are putting in all the work on these projects, or the bulk of the work on these projects. So with that, I think that the starting point for today's talk is in some ways an opportunity to underscore the 20th birthday of Wikipedia, and really share in that kind of sense of amazement at the fact that these communities not only exist but have in many ways become the standard of open and accessible knowledge resources for the world, and in some ways the biggest and most open and accessible knowledge resources that human societies have ever created. So a couple things to note about that. One is that the birthday is really about the English language edition of Wikipedia at some level, and I think that's important for some of the things that I'll talk about in a minute. The other is that there's a long conversation that this work is kind of a part of that is also recognized in this recent published volume, edited volume, co-edited by Joseph Riegel and Jackie Kerner from the MIT Press, that looks back at some of the social and intellectual concerns that have arisen over the 20 years of Wikipedia and the related projects, and that also tries to think about what vision should guide the future of these movements. And in that sense, I think it's that kind of large-scale, long-term thinking that that I'm trying to point towards with this work today. And part of that relates to the chapter that Benjamin Mako-Hill and I contributed to this book, which is really focuses on Wikipedia research and the kind of resource that Wikipedia and Wikipedia communities have provided for researchers. In a lot of ways, what we try to argue in that chapter is that these communities have become among the most important publicly accessible laboratories for social and computing research in the world. And despite the fact that there are now thousands, probably tens of thousands, I'm not confident about the exact number, of research papers and publications that look at Wikipedia communities in a number of different ways, even those of us who spend a lot of time doing this don't feel totally confident that we have a comprehensive understanding of what has worked and why things have worked as well as they have, and in many cases what prevents things from working better across these communities. So the work that I'm going to talk about is really a part of that conversation, and there are lots of other people who are part of that conversation too, including the members of the research team here, and many of you who may or may not be watching this at some point, but who are part of the conversation that this work is a part of. So most of the research that's happened before has looked within that single largest community, the birthday of which we are kind of celebrating this year, which is the English language Wikipedia. And of course, English language Wikipedia is just the tip of the iceberg in a lot of ways. One of those ways is that there are about 300 language editions of Wikipedia. But beyond that, there are also, thousands of other communities. Some of them are official Wikimedia communities, but many of them are not. And across those communities at this point, we can talk about millions of participants, and we can talk about the ways that they provide really critical social and digital infrastructure across many, many parts of the world and many, many domains. So the work that our research group, the Community Data Science Collective, does in relation to this space is to really try to think about a science of community organizations and really contribute to that with our work. Personally, I do work on a few different topics in this space. I also do a lot of work that studies participation inequalities and participation divides and how those emerge and what, how to think about those. That's largely not what I'm going to talk about or focus on today. Instead, I'm really going to focus on this thinking about community organizations from the perspective of organization science and organizational studies. And within that, there's a sort of broad and crude dichotomy within that field, which is that there's sort of what people talk about as micro-level organizational research, which really focuses within organizations and on the kind of behavior of individuals, their motivations, the behavior of leaders, and those kinds of intra-organizational phenomena. And then there's macro level organizational science or organizational research, which focuses on thinking about the kind of institutions and environments, and in the case of sort of firms or nonprofits, thinking about industries, right? Organizations in their context, broadly speaking. And that's really where I'm going to try to focus the conversation here. Across organizations, I think we can think about sort of these broad kinds of typologies of the relationships that exist between communities. And I'm going to try to talk about three sort of crude types. This is not meant to be an exhaustive or comprehensive characterization of the possible kinds of relationships or patterns you might observe when you look across communities, but it is a way to think about some common threads in the work that's happened in our group and that is happening in our group and that is happening in this space more broadly. And what I mentioned, and I'll elaborate these three types in just a moment, but what I mentioned before is that I'm going to try to illustrate each type with some work in progress being led by a student member of the Community Data Science Collective. I'm involved in all of them, so I'm not just sort of riffing on other people's work here completely, but really try to think across these different types of work and what the implications are within each of them, and then at the end, a little bit across all three of them. So starting with one kind here, I want to start with what I think really initiated the research that I and the members of our group do in this space. And that was thinking about patterns across communities, really focusing on convergence or shared patterns that replicate across many communities. I should also mention at this point, I forgot to say this at the beginning, but I'm not really going to be able to monitor the chat during this. So if things do come up or if issues arise, please somebody speak up. So the first kind of convergence I want to focus on is one of the kinds of convergence that I think is sort of most widely thought about or talked about across the different Wikipedia communities, at least. And that is this pattern of a rise and decline in active editors. So the most famous among these plots that I suspect some of you have seen before is the one in the top left corner here, which is the plot of the active editors in the English language Wikipedia. And this plot extends through about 2019. We haven't generated new ones since then just yet. But what you're looking at here is approximately the monthly count of active editors, editors making 5 or more edits per month over the lifetime of the English language Wikipedia. And then the other plots are other language editions. So hopefully you can read the labels for them, but we've got French, Italian, Japanese, German, Spanish, Russian, and Polish here as well. And what's interesting and what we've looked at in some of our work is thinking really about how this pattern is not isolated to English Wikipedia and trying to understand what that means. So, just substantively, we've looked at this across a number of language editions for Wikipedias, but we've also looked across other kinds of wikis as well. So we've had a few papers that our members of our group have published looking at wikis in Wikia. And some of the largest wikis there do seem to follow a similar pattern as well. And we've also looked at patterns, not just in terms of active editors, but in terms of new editors making contributions and the retention of new editors over time and the turnover among administrators and leaders within communities. And across all of these different dimensions, we found not curves that look exactly like this per se, but patterns that pretty closely resemble, on the whole, the patterns we see among the largest language edition Wikipedias. So what I want to focus on in terms of new work in this space today and new evidence of kind of convergent patterns across communities is builds on a study from a few years ago that was published by two colleagues, two faculty members at the University of Colorado Boulder, Brian Keegan and Casey Fiesler, also presumably no strangers to this, this community. in a number of ways. But what they focused on in this paper was really looking at policies and rules, essentially, within the English language Wikipedia. And some work that we are doing right now, led by a PhD student at Northwestern, to look across some of the largest language editions to think about how the patterns around rule creation and rule revision activity occur or look across 5 of the largest language editions. So this is work being led by So-Hyun Wang. She's a PhD student at Northwestern working in our group. And you know, this is unpublished work that we're developing right now, where what she has done is really draw a comparison across these 5 largest language editions. In this case, to look at when rules were created. And what you might notice here is the sort of yellowish or lighter orange of the dots and lines here corresponds to English. But we've got 4 other language editions overlaid on this same plot. And Keegan and Fiesler had looked at the years in which rules were created in the English language Wikipedia. This is showing the years in which rule pages are created across these different language editions since 2001. And what you can see is that while there are some variations at the language edition level, there's also a lot of commonality where the bulk of rulemaking, or rule editing at least, appears to have occurred relatively early on, prior to about 2007 or so. And over the last 10 years, the proportion of, the percentage of rules created has really declined to a tiny fraction year in, year out. I should also mention at this point that one of the issues with this work has confronted, and this is sort of foreshadowing something I'll talk about more in a minute, has been that it's really hard to compare rules across language editions. We may think of Wikipedias as all sharing in the 5 pillars and all sharing in the ways that they have edit pages and talk pages and things like that, and all aspiring to create encyclopedic content. But just as some of the earlier work looking at articles discovered a lot of sort of content incompatibilities or coverage gaps across language editions, our work has also uncovered a lot of incompatibility and incommensurability in terms of rules. But the interesting convergence point here really focuses on the way that editing activity and rule creation activity was really focused in the first 5 to 7 years of a lot of these communities and has declined a lot since then. So to show you one more graph from this work, this is a slightly different measure on the y-axis here. So what this corresponds to is the percentage of edits or revisions that are happening on rule pages themselves versus rule plus talk pages over time, right? So what we're seeing in this one is an overall decline, reflecting the fact that the revision activity in the policy namespace, right? What in the English language edition I think we would call the policy namespace, is increasingly happening on talk pages versus on rule pages versus on the policy pages themselves. Now, this encompasses policies and guidelines and other things in other language editions too, but the pattern is pretty consistent, right? We see this kind of decline over time as the activity on the rules is shifting to the discussion space, right? And so what this reflects is, really this larger pattern. Nope, I just want to confirm. I just accidentally scrolled. Okay, so you should be looking at a slide that says convergence and it talks about isomorphism in the top bullet point. Hopefully that's still true. But what this really underscores for us is this idea that there are dimensions along which communities are experiencing these isomorphic patterns, where they take on similar structures over time. And this fits with, is consistent with these other patterns of rise and decline, of the entrenchment of leadership, and of the formalization of communities, right? Now, when we want to talk about why we see these patterns along some dimensions and not others, that's a really fantastic question that I don't have anything resembling a comprehensive answer to. In terms of rulemaking and formalization, I think, you know, and the sort of decline of new editors over time, I think the way that I would talk about this is really thinking about the trade-offs that a lot of communities experience as they grow between maintaining sort of open boundaries and open opportunities for participation, right? So that they can mobilize new community members and attract new people to create new content versus the governance or protection of existing material in the communities. So I think there's a trade-off there that a lot of communities experience, and I think that that's not necessarily something that's bad. It's just, it speaks to the challenges of sustaining a large-scale collaborative enterprise as the resources that communities have produced have become more valuable and more important over time. All right, so let's shift to the next pattern here, which is really to focus on sort of the complement of convergence, but divergence. And I foreshadowed this in a number of ways by talking about some of these things in the convergence section. But you know, the most obvious way in which there's divergence that we can start to think about is just looking at the y-axes of these plots again, right? The numbers of active editors are, one, wildly different, and they're wildly different in ways that don't necessarily correspond to some kind of natural limit in terms of the number of potential editors or potential community members within any given language edition, right? So, you know, here, the work that our group is pursuing in this space is to really develop some focused comparisons to understand reasons behind divergence. We are looking in particular in a new study of what we're calling underrepresented language editions. And this is work being led by Sejal Khatri, who is a recently graduated master's student from the University of Washington School of Information, and is currently applying to PhD programs this year, but she's still a member of the group. She's still doing great work. And in this study, Sejal composed a qualitative, in-depth comparison of 3 language editions: Malayalam, Marathi, and Kannada. These are all Indic language editions. And I'll show you a little bit more in a moment, but the baseline that sort of motivates the study here is that we think in a lot of ways these are communities that at a sort of superficial level should be comparable, right? They have a lot more in common with each other than, say, you know, a language that is, you know, a massive kind of powerful language of the global political economy like English. And they share relatively common numbers of language speakers. And in theory, they could have comparable language edition Wikipedias. But what you see in these 3 plots here is that while there are, you know, some ways in which these communities are, you know, there's one set of patterns that you can see in the top here in terms of the number of monthly visitors that are coming to the content pages for these language editions. But what you see in the bottom 2 plots is that in terms of content creation and content quantity, Malayalam is just much more active and much bigger than the other 2. And that really motivates a puzzle in terms of why. Why is it that Malayalam Wikipedia has been able to grow and engage so many more editors so much more effectively than the other 2? Right. And here's just another table that sort of illustrates the reasons why we think these are comparable and some of those differences. So, you know, I'm not going to talk through every row and column of this, but what you can see in the top is that, you know, the encyclopedias are really created around a similar time. If anything, Malayalam has the smallest number of native speakers, but it has the largest number of articles with you know, the most in-depth content. I'm not going to go into the details of the measurement there. We'll wait until the paper comes out to share the specifics on that. But it's nothing that we're not trying to do anything controversial here. And then in terms of engagement, right, the bottom half of the table here, we see again that Malayalam is just much more active levels of engagement along everything except page views. Per language edition on a per language edition basis, right? So why is it that Malayalam has been, you know, where we've seen these communities that could in theory be comparable, giving rise to what are essentially substantially different sizes and engagement of Wikipedia editions. And I'm not going to go into in depth in terms of the results of Sejal's work on this. She conducted a comparative qualitative analysis where she interviewed community members across all 3 language editions, really did a ton of work to try to understand from the perspectives of community members why they were experiencing these differences and what they observed about their communities. And what the core of her findings really reflect thus far is that the communities are not just these kind of isolated things that are comparable and similar entities, right? And in some ways this is kind of obvious, but they're embedded within these broader sets of social relationships and institutions. And that is not just at the level of the communities themselves, but also of the broader language speaking and language reading communities of which they're a part. Within the language communities that correspond to these 3 Wikipedias, for example, there's this long and broad history of participatory organization within Kerala, which is the region of India where Malayalam is predominantly spoken. And there's some ways in which that history of participatory movements and organizations may have helped facilitate a certain kind of set of community dynamics within Malayalam Wikipedia that have in turn allowed it to grow and build more active and engaged community base over its lifetime. Right. So what this really speaks to is the fact that community engagement, and in this case, I don't care what measure you use, but community engagement is not something that you can isolate completely. You can't isolate it completely from the kind of social and cultural context of the language community where the language is being spoken and written that is being used to create the project. And you can't isolate it from the impacts that context may have on the kind of culture of the community itself that evolves over time. So the bonus kind of sneak preview finding from this study that I think is especially interesting in light of the work that organizations like the Foundation do to try to support these different communities is that external funding and resources can sometimes make these kinds of patterns worse. So what we saw in Marathi and Kannada in these cases is that the support of external resources in some cases validated the more powerful and entrenched members of these underrepresented language edition communities who have then proceeded to essentially replicate kind of the exclusion of other editors from their communities over time. So, again, I'm going to leave the details for Sejal's work, and as it gets published to a large extent, I'm happy to have conversations about it in Q&A, but it's a tough nut to crack here, right? Once you have a community that is developing and going well, it can often seem like you can sort of do no wrong. Whereas on the other side, when you have a community that struggles to get off the ground, it can even be hard to find solutions using external resources to help it grow and solve its problems and achieve those higher levels of engagement that can be so important for allowing underrepresented language edition Wikipedias to really serve the broad public interest that they can have for speakers of those languages. Okay, so let's go on to the third and last pattern that I want to talk about today, which is interdependence. And what I'll underscore before I really talk about any of the substance here is just that so far we've been talking about these communities in large part as these kind of independent and comparable units of analysis, right? The idea that communities are sort of like firms or social movements or something in other types of organizational research are these things that exist on their own, more or less, and that you can compare across them fairly. And that's really a reductive assumption, right? And we're aware of that. Everybody else who does this kind of research is aware of that. But the third area of work really asks us to think about is what happens when you relax that assumption. And one way to motivate this work is to look at a relationship between two sites that exemplify a couple of different things. So this is a plot of host signups on Airbnb and Couchsurfing, right? And for those of you who may not be familiar with Couchsurfing, it's a lot like Airbnb. It makes it possible to sort of host guests in a residential space that you own or rent or something like that. And it existed long before couch surfing, and it did not involve any financial exchange as part of the exchange of couches or sleeping spaces. So Airbnb comes in on the scene around 2008 and really offers a commercialized version of this kind of exchange, and it takes off and blows up. And there's a paper here that I'm pulling this graph from, which is led by Max Klein and collaborated on by a number of other people, including some members of the Community Data Science Collective, which looks at some of the ways in which couch surfing's sort of rise really comes in part at the expense of Airbnb. So the fact that the Airbnb user base or its host base, which is what you see in the sort of pinkish line here, declines after 2010 is related to the rise of couch surfing. So what this suggests is that there are these kinds of ecological dynamics among communities, right? And in this case, it's a dynamic of essentially predation, right? Where couch surfing had been relying on a relatively, sort of finite resource in some sense, and Airbnb is coming along and utilizing that resource at the expense of couch surfing's user base. So there's some new work that is being led in our group by Nate Bluntweis of the University of Washington, who's also done a bunch of great work with the foundation, the Wikimedia Foundation over the years, where what Nate is really interested in understanding here are the varieties of different kinds of ecological relationships that might exist across and among communities. So this is a table from a work in progress that Nate is leading that really borrows on some earlier work in organizational ecology that tries to think about the different kinds of relationships you can see across communities. And in this case, the relationship focuses on these kinds of interactions that you can see, right? So predation is just one among many, as you can see looking across the rows. And I'm not going to go in depth on the substance of the table here, but the main idea here is that you can have relationships between communities that are mutualistic or kind of mutually supportive or encourage the growth of one, encourages the growth of the other, as well as communities that are in direct competition with one another, where they sort of fight for each other's lunch, more or less, as well as kind of a variety of other permutations of these kinds of relations that exist. Right. So what the work that Nate is doing right now is really developing empirical strategies and computational strategies to identify and classify these kinds of relationships at scale. And that's work that is currently under review right now and hopefully will be coming out soon. So the payoff here in terms of thinking about these kinds of ecological relationships and ecological dynamics is that you can think about communities existing within these kinds of networks of what are called commensal relationships. Commensal relationships are just the different types of interactions that we saw in the previous slide in that table, right? So communities may exist as these distinct entities, but they also may have these kinds of networks of relationships, which mean that interventions at any one point in that network may impact other parts of it or not. And so at a practical strategic level, in terms of thinking about work to try to encourage growth or sustainability of many communities, those interdependencies can play a big role in terms of what any one intervention might do. The other bonus kind of payoff of this kind of work is that what we see is that depending on the kind of relationship that exists between communities, that it means that different kinds of interventions may have different kinds of impacts. And one thing that we're really pleased about is that looking across these different kinds of commensal relationships has led us to find some solutions to contradictions that existed in prior work, where we thought things like, well, maybe overlap in membership across communities is a good thing or a bad thing. There were prior studies that suggested both of those findings to be true. And what we're starting to see is that the overlap of membership, the impact of that may really depend on the kind of relationship between the communities overall. So hopefully we have more to report on this soon, but it's just kind of a sneak peek. So, all right, so let's talk about takeaways and then hopefully open it up for some conversation. overall, I've tried to talk about these three kinds of patterns that we've observed across communities, and shared some ongoing work that illustrates each pattern. I want to emphasize two ways in which this is really not a complete reflection of anything. One way is that, there are many other possible kinds of patterns that we could see, right? That last section on the different kinds of ecological commensal relationships where we might observe interactions between communities suggests that not only are these three types incomplete, but within these three types, the kind of ecological dynamic space suggests that there's a broad array of things. And really, nobody, I think, at this point has any idea of how to characterize the full space, right? What kinds of relationships prevail across these different spaces is really hard to assess at this time. The other piece of this that I want to underscore is that we're, just a few people doing a very small subset of the work in this space, and that there are a lot of kinds of research that touch on these concerns and that go beyond the things I've talked about here, right? So, for example, we could also have a conversation about whether there may be patterns of growth or decline that are impacting the space of pure production communities overall, right? So not just growth or decline within wikis or Wikipedia language editions, but growth or decline across all of these different kinds of communities that may relate to broader social, political, economic factors. And that's a wider, kind of even more macro level of conversation we could have than what I've tried to raise here. But I'm happy to talk about any of that, and just want to again acknowledge the folks who have done a lot of the work that's reflected here. These are members of our research group at our most recent remote meetup, and the organizations that have supported a lot of this work, in particular the NSF. So I'll stop sharing my slides there and say thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Erin, for the talk. Great to learn so much. I think there are plenty of questions from the room. I don't see any questions from the chat or from IRC. Maybe then let's, as a reminder, if you have questions, you want to join the discussion, put your questions there. Isaac will relay them to Erin here, and then we'll hopefully start discussing. Otherwise, I will pass it to the room if there are any open questions here. Leila, I see your hand up. Go for it.
Erin, thank you so much for the presentation. A special thanks because you're talking about ongoing research, which is really exciting. Thank you so much. I have a lot of questions, but I'll start with one and let others ask also questions as well. One is about when you talked about divergence. I want to dig with you a little bit more on this front because especially the issue of grants and how to distribute grants is something which is very present for Wikipedia Foundation. While we are not part of the grants team within Wikimedia Foundation, we work relatively closely with the team. And there's really kind of a deep, honest effort to try to understand where to make the investments, right? And the resources are very limited. So I want to ask you with kind of the grants hat on, can you share more about what you have learned in that space? What are the kind of patterns that you see working and the patterns that you see are not working? If you have any recommendations for places that we as a research team, we as a research community, or the grants team can look into further, any insights would be great.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, Leila. And I think, so I think a couple things, and I want to preface it by just saying that the study that, in the particular study, right, so this is the study of the 3 small language editions that I talked about. The particular study that informs this is, it's pretty small scale, right? So I don't want to pretend that we've got, sort of generalizable insights here that necessarily apply across all contexts. But in some ways, that is the insight of this study, which is that I think, what was interesting and informative to us about this is that when we started this, we didn't have a clear reason to think that things would be so different across these communities. And it was really through a process of kind of Sejal, really kind of pushing and continuing to ask the community members who she interviewed, well, why do you think things work this way in your community? Or why do you think they don't work this way in your community? And I think that the biggest finding there that speaks to grant making work in this space, I think, is that, in terms of evaluating grant proposals or conducting research that can inform the effective use of grants, is that the boundaries of the impact of the communities and of the impact of the grants are really broader than just the metrics of engagement that might be visible within the site. So it speaks to the idea that I think there was some findings that really spoke to the importance of potentially using external resources to both support kind of longstanding community leaders, but also to really focus on identifying situationally specific tactics for doing outreach and engagement. So by situationally specific, what I mean is that it might be that something that worked in Malayalam won't work, right? There might not be a singular best practice. There likely won't be. And some of that may relate to the culture of the community itself, and some of that may relate to the region or the language community that you're trying to recruit volunteers and contributors from, and that the task of developing strategies to address that really can only proceed in a case-by-case basis. So I think that's sort of where, the specifics of the three cases I want to kind of hold off on a little bit, just because I think that I'm not the best person to speak to the findings in that respect. But, I think that that's really the high-level finding, right? This idea that communities aren't these kind of free-floating entities that somehow sit outside of the social relationships and inequalities within a given language space, but are really deeply embedded in that, and the need to find interventions that can identify, both constraints and strategies for change that work within that context. I don't know. That's a very vague response. I'm not totally satisfied by it, but does it speak to your question at least?
No, that is helpful, and I understand that it is a difficult question. It's a difficult area to, given the kind of smaller scale information that is available to you. Maybe I can ask like a follow-up, which is, did you find examples that you feel comfortable sharing about the types of investments that didn't work for a particular community? Sorry, and I should say it's not only that it didn't work. What I heard from you was that it sometimes can create negative effect.
Yeah. So an example there is that I think there were, and I've seen this across a couple of language editions, including some that weren't included in this study. So I feel totally comfortable sharing this, which is that there were cases where, because many communities, right, as we saw in some of those initial graph, there are many communities where the number of core volunteers and contributors is very small. And over time, in some cases, they may have created rules and cultures that, despite whatever intentions they may have had, wind up erecting really high barriers to entry for newcomers, right? So in many cases, interventions that reinforce or further empower or, give additional resources to the leaders of those communities can, in these cases, despite, again, the best intentions of the people sending the resources and the people leading the communities, can just reinforce those patterns of sort of the narrowing of participation, right? And so I think that this is where, right, and it's a tough problem, in part because it's so crucial to empower community leaders in a lot of these volunteer-led movement organizations. And it's also crucial to work in partnership with them to sort of expand the volunteer communities and to expand the group of leaders. So I think, we really saw a few of these cases where, and have seen this in other spaces too, where empowering existing leaders can have this sort of double-edged quality to it, where you just wind up sort of, further reducing the accessibility overall, and that can be, a source of tension and can be really politically fraught within communities too.
Thank you.
Great. Then before opening up to the audience, there was one more question here in the room, I think from Diego.
Yeah, Aaron, thank you for the talk. There's a lot of things to talk about. I just want to ask one question that, in fact, is two questions. Have you looked in any aspect to the content? Because I'm wondering if there are Wikipedias that are more, or the growth of some wikis can be related with, that are focusing on a particular topic. Let's say they talk a lot about sports, and it's like this community is very enthusiastic editing because they update every soccer game or cricket game, and this creates a lot of edits. Or can be something completely different. And in the same side, have you compared with if these wikis are talking more about global related content or more local content? There's these data sets released in this project led by Mark Michael, the Diversity Culture Observatory, where they tell you if a piece of content is kind of local or global or something, if it's local or not, more or less. And in the same line, I'm thinking how this would be related with external factors, but I'm not thinking now in grants or how the Wikimedia Foundation acts on this, but more in how many other resources there are on the internet on that language. And I'm curious about that because it could be two things. It could be if there's a lot of other resources in one language, Wikipedia won't grow because you already have resources on that language. Or could be that given that there's a lot of resources, there are a lot of material to write Wikipedia on that language, and this makes the Wikipedia growth. And especially in many countries, there are some languages that people when people is completely like they use some language in the internet and the other language is not. If you have any proxy to understand how many other resources there are on the internet on that particular language, how this is affected. So they're interested in looking how the content, some characteristic of the content affects this different growth.
Yeah, that's a great set of questions, Diego. And I think, the short answer, there's a very short answer and then there's a longer answer. The really short answer is that the members in our group haven't spent as much time trying to understand that in the context of Wikipedia language editions specifically. So in some ways, I don't have a direct answer. And I think, it's work by folks like you that have largely informed me on this specific area that you're talking about. So in that sense, I'm sorry, I don't have a lot to add. But the longer answer and the more potentially useful answer is that we've spent some time, and this has really been work that, again, Nate and others have pursued, where we have looked more at things like topic overlap and in terms of content production in other spaces, really. So this is, Nate's currently doing some work looking at subreddits and has done some work before looking at online petitions, right? And those are situations where we've been able to identify, sort of more generalist and specialist topic spaces and try to understand, right? There's a nice theory from organizational ecology called density dependence, right? Which is this kind of, it borrows from population ecology and tries to think about when you are in situations where there might be scarce or finite resources, what strategies are most advantageous for the survival of a given organism or a given species. And in this context, I think we've seen that so far, at least in the work we've done, we have not seen the kind of, density dependent relationship. So in other words, right, the classic finding from organizational research is that you've got a sort of trade-off where if you've got a space where there's not a lot of competition for attention or resources, then the more organizations or communities are active in that space, right, the bigger and better things look, right? There's sort of this like benefit, like the rising tide lifts all boats across communities. Whereas once you get to a point where there's some kind of like critical mass or something of competition, then you start to see a trade-off emerge. So a classic example here would be like a given industry where firms are competing for market share. Right? If you've got a new industry, or you know, say when you know Apple first launches the iPhone, right? At first, that's able to just that space is able to blow up, and sort of anybody who's able to release a fully featured smartphone is, you know, just grabbing consumers and customers hand over fist. As the space becomes more densely populated, the companies start to compete, and so you start to see this kind of like, you know, the probability of any new firm selling more smartphones decreases, right, over time as the space gets more dense. So there are some of those dynamics, but we haven't found as clear evidence of that in the case of specifically petitions, right? So it does seem like there's some differences in terms of, you know, the fact that communities can reuse each other's content, that resources in terms of volunteer time or content may not be as scarce, at least in some domains as they are in, say, like, you know, which smartphone device we choose to purchase. Right, I'm not going to own a lot of these, but I might contribute, I might sign a lot of petitions, or I might contribute to a lot of communities without a huge added cost. So, and there may be different returns in that case to communities being more embracing strategies of being more generalist versus more specialist, right? So I think you sort of pointed at this in part of your comment when you said where, you know, if I'm focusing on more global or more general content, is that a helpful strategy versus focusing on more local content? And, you know, again, we have not looked at this in the context of language editions of encyclopedias, so I don't have a good answer or thought really there. But I think this is something where we are looking into it in terms of some of these subreddit community analyses that Nate is doing, and then another member of the group, Kaylee Champion, is doing some work looking at you know, software development, free and open source software communities, to try to understand if you've got a piece of software that is a more critical dependency across, say, a distribution of an open source operating system, right? Is that more likely to be a piece of software that attracts contributors? What drives the sort of ability to attract volunteers if you've got a more general purpose thing versus a more narrowly purposed thing? So that's an area that we're interested in too. I just don't have a better solution.
Thank you, Isaac. There are lots of questions from IRC and YouTube, from what I can tell. So.
Yep. We've got 3 right now. The first one is coming from IRC, and they know you made a very convincing case for the importance of this kind of macro level comparative research. We'd love to hear more of your thoughts on what other research disciplines we can learn from in terms of methodology. An example that was given was, you know, branches of economics that compare different counties or countries to look at the impact of different kind of policies.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and economics is a great example that's really influenced a lot of the way that our group does our work. You know, I think the things that we've gravitated towards so far have been, you know, organizational research really is a sort of math that cuts across a few different social science disciplines. So econ is one of those. And I think the person asking the question is really referring to sort of like cross-national econometrics and thinking about kind of comparative economics across nation states or regions. But there's also economic studies of industries and things like that. And I think the other one that I've referred to here is research on ecology. And in particular, I know Nate's work has been really shaped by mathematical ecology. So the studies of species and community ecology, right? So there's sort of 2 areas within that. There's population ecology, which really tries to think about, like, you know, at the level of like a population of a certain type of fish, right? Like why is the population, rising or falling, and how likely is the next organism that's born be to survive based on the dynamics in that population. But then there's also community ecology, which considers like that species of fish in relation to the crabs and the starfish and the seaweed and the anemones that all live nearby, and how those kind of interrelate with each other. I would say other spaces that are really informing the work that we're doing these days, it also include thinking about governance more broadly, right? So I think the topic of internet governance and community governance and online communities is really growing across a lot of fields right now. For us, a lot of that is thinking about drawing from theories of, Commensal resource management. So that's really the work of like Elinor Ostrom, which was kind of a hybrid of political science and economics to begin with, and environmental economics as well. And then also drawing just from sort of theories of, political sociology too, and political science, right? The ways that people talk about what kinds of governance arrangements produce what kinds of outcomes across what kinds of settings, influenced by what kinds of factors, right? That's in a nutshell a way to talk about the entire field of political science. So we're really trying to pull from across those different spaces. Beyond that, I'm trying to think if there are others that really are shaping the work that we're doing. I think that probably represents our group's work the best. I think there are a lot of other influences out there, and I would say, network analysis is a great example of a methodological approach that's been applied across a whole bunch of different topic domains. And I think what we're trying to do is both borrow from, theoretical or scientific approaches, as well as different methodological toolkits that we can sort of cross-pollinate and repurpose for various ways. So I think that there's a big, broad space here.
Great, thanks. I know I personally borrowed a lot from your research methodology, so keep bringing in the new influences. All right, next question comes from YouTube, and there's a lot of buzz around Sejal's work with the re-indic communities. And in particular, they're asking what other factors you looked at to explain some of these divergent patterns, whatever you can share. The example of literacy was brought up in the chat as one potentially important one in that particular context, but I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I should just say, I'm really excited about that work too. And hopefully we'll be able to, share the full version of that research soon. I think it's a really great study. In that particular one, Sejal spent some time investigating some of the sort of what I'll call the sort of social cultural context for the different communities in terms of the number of language speakers and things like that. And so we didn't dive as deeply into, trying to, for example, assess the specific degree to which a single kind of factor like that might or might not determine the, ability of the language edition to engage volunteers, right? So that's not what this study really does best. Now, that said, I think that this is a place where, and this is sort of pointing to some of the other work that I and other people have been involved in, where I think there are other ways to talk about, within a given language edition or context. I think there has been some work to understand what barriers to participation there might be, right? And that's a case where I think, there's a long history of stratification research, for example, within the US. And also work that looks at sort of inequalities in terms of income, in terms of education, in terms of life outcomes. And, so this is sort of merging my response to this question with the previous question. I would say that's really what, where I'm trying to draw on to understand what is it that prevents, people who might otherwise be willing and able volunteers from joining communities. And I think that, there's probably a space for much larger scale kind of comparative analysis there too. Most of the studies I've been involved in that space, for example, have really looked at survey data from US adult internet users. And that's a very small subset of the world's population of the potential contributors to things like free and open knowledge production on the internet. And what we found there may or may not generalize across that, especially when we start talking about things that have in communities and societies where there are long histories of colonialism, or sort of longer histories of colonial oppression that have persisted up through the present, right? You know, in the US, you have to talk about, you know, histories of slavery and legacies of racialized inequality and policing really impacting the ways that people use resources like the internet, and gain access to resources like education that really shape who participates and who doesn't, right? So I think there's, you know, it starts to get into the really multidimensional and thick, thorny problems about inequality and the persistence of inequality across societies. And I think those are the kinds of questions that Sejal's work can really push us to think about more deeply, especially for underrepresented language communities on the internet. But I don't think that work really singles out any single factor in quite that way yet.
Thank you. The next one is about just the excitement about the fact you're doing cross-wiki work. And this is from somebody who's also trying to get more involved in that research community and wondering whether you have recommendations for kind of places to find more of this research that's looking at multiple communities, or I don't know, maybe even conferences where this is kind of more interest, or like this sort of work might come up.
Yeah, that's a really great question too. And it's, I think that, you know, there are a few different areas, and I think that, you know, there's, as I said in the talk, our group is not the only group in this space, and you know, I'm looking around the room where the research team members who are part of this are participating, and I would say that a lot of them are the most actively contributing to these conversations around comparing across different language editions of wikis and Wikipedia. And there are a bunch of different conferences and publication venues. So, you know, I'm almost hesitant to even try to create a list. I think maybe this is a space where, I don't know if there is something that like anyone on the research team has tried to assemble or can point to a place where we can sort of look at the different kinds of work happening in this space. But, you know, to name a few, right, there's a lot of work within the field of human-computer interaction and social computing research where this happens. And some of the studies that I mentioned in this talk have been published in those domains and spaces. There's a lot of work within information science and sort of information systems and management research that looks at this work. So that's probably the kind of subspace that touches most on some of this like organizational type of analysis that I mentioned here. There's also a lot of work within a few different social science disciplines. So I'm a faculty member in a department of communication, and there are a number of communication journals, right, where work like this has been published, as well as some in sociology, political science, economics. And really, I would say the best resource for this is probably the Wikipedia Research Newsletter, which has been a resource that's been sustained over the years, really through the work of volunteers connected with the foundation and beyond. You know, I don't know, if the person who asked the question wants to get in touch, I'm happy to share a few like pointers and resources in that respect. But I think that the newsletter is probably the best one-stop shop for kind of like trying to aggregate the work that at least touches directly on Wikimedia communities in this domain. And that's probably a good starting point for starting to learn about like where the different academic fields that touch on this might be located. I don't know. I also want to like punt this to the rest of the research team members because I think they are at least as informed as I am about this and probably more so.
I personally know it matters a lot to me, and I think a takeaway from me is that maybe I'll try to start a wiki research thread on it too to collect some more examples of research that's doing this sort of cross-wiki work, because there is not enough but a lot going on, and it is, yeah, it's a really exciting space. Are there others in the room who have questions? Otherwise, I'll go.
Go for it, Isaac. I know.
All right. So Erin, we've gotten a couple of questions, not today, but in kind of in the recent past about how you might kind of study or measure the resilience of a community, so kind of the robustness of a community. And I'm curious, and I think I'm curious most about some of the things that maybe aren't on Wiki that might point to this. But if you have thoughts about things you could compute from, data available about wikis, that's obviously interesting too. But I'd be curious what your thoughts are around the sorts of factors to really pay attention to when thinking about the resilience of a community.
Wow, that's a big question. I think, in some ways this is probably, so I mentioned one of the University of Washington students, Kaylee Champion, who's doing work on free and open source software projects. I think her work is probably the one that speaks most to this. And there, what we're really drawing on is thinking about, it sort of builds on some of that misalignment work that Morten Wonker-Wang and a few other folks have been involved in through the foundation over the years. So thinking about spaces where resources are really crucially valuable, but being potentially sort of under-provisioned relative to the demand or interest in them that exists. And I think that, in that case, the approach that we've really taken is to try to detect high, like critical value resources, right? So you can define that in a variety of different ways. That, in the case of like encyclopedia articles, maybe it's just high page views, right? That are dependent on either small or kind of brittle groups of collaborators, or where the existing groups of collaborators are not, their effort to produce new resources is not matching the need for those resources. I could imagine trying to build analyses that generalized from that looked at things like burnout among community leaders. So at this point, I suspect it would be possible to assemble data on, essentially leaders who rage quit, right? I could imagine building, right, if you could identify instances of community leaders or volunteers quitting or being banned, right, or things like that, and you could try to understand what leads to that, right? These are, in a sense, people who are really important, crucial resources for the survival and sustainability of a community who, for a variety of reasons, perhaps are, burning out and falling off the cliff of contribution, and that can be really crucial. I could also imagine that, when you think about other kind of vulnerabilities, I guess this really bridges into thinking about like a threat model for community survival. And that's something that is not a core area that I'm deeply informed about, but I think, you can imagine how to take some of those security research approaches to thinking about developing threat models for community thriving or sustainability or content quality. And I think that, in those cases, I would say you probably need to throw, I would be inclined to sort of say like, all right, let's figure out the threat models and then go from there. So can we identify that there are on-community threats or on-community resources that we can identify as particularly crucial and then study those? Can we identify off-community threats or resources, right? So, maybe there's evidence that things like coordinated attacks are the real problem. Well, my guess is that spending time looking at edit histories is not going to give you a ton of information about coordinated attacks on particular communities, right? Or, maybe what's necessary there is to try to develop a strategy that really identifies previous instances of coordinated attacks and investigates them qualitatively and develops a toolkit aimed at responding. I think that, resilience is so multidimensional that that it's hard for me to think in more kind of specific focused ways, I guess. I don't know. I'd be curious what other folks are working on in that space before I stick my foot in my mouth any further.
Any remaining questions? here.
I would say maybe one response to your question, Erin, which is we have been thinking a lot in the team about kind of the role of the research team at the Wikimedia Foundation as part of kind of this broader ecosystem of research. And coming back to your question, one of the hypotheses that I have is that resilient Wikimedia communities need a global network of researchers that can work closely with these communities. Now, it's very different than the nature of some of the examples that you brought up, and that's exactly why I want to put it out there. So we think about like developers, researchers, community organizers, of course, editors who do the actual edit on the project directly, and the other parts of the ecosystem. But I wanted to kind of underline the importance of researchers from our point of view in that space. Again, it's a hypothesis, but yeah, there are reasons for that hypothesis.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and I think you know it also speaks to there is some other work on kind of interorganizational networks that I think could speak to this. It's interesting that I'm only partly familiar with through the fact that some colleagues in my department do it, but I think it does suggest that partnerships across both organizations that are trying to solve similar or analogous problems, as well as partnerships between organizations that can address multiple aspects of a kind of ecosystem, right? So I think there's a community ecology element to that as well, where I think your response really speaks to that well, and I would also share that bet or hypothesis that is a key resource. And I think if you look at, sectors of whether it's economic activity or nonprofit activity or voluntary organizations and movements that achieve long-term goals and transformations of societies, I would also bet that would be a space where you would see evidence of this, where it's this kind of like multi-dimensional, multi-stakeholder, multi-level, right, a sort of polycentric kind of thing where you have to build the whole thing to really create a resilient web of ties that can be robust to a variety of different challenges and threats, like American democracy, for example. So to go back to where we started our day. And I think that's it's not totally unrelated in the sense that I think what this year's electoral process experience in the United States has illustrated to me is, as much as anything, that there are, real weak points in that web of institutions and organizations and actors, and real vulnerabilities that, I think, that I think are opportunities for exploitation, right? And exploitation of various kinds. I think in this case, we saw some examples of that in the last few weeks. But, I think that thinking about how to generalize from the specifics of American political institutions to something like volunteer wiki communities is all about this, is all about thinking about, okay, what did we see here that was this kind of like where this web of institutions and actors and support and ancillary actors, right? I mean, there's so much involved in something like American politics and elections that's an example of, right? That's a space where even, however many years and however many people working in that space to sort of shift agendas and move things, I think this year illustrates how fragile a lot of that really is and can be. So.
With this, I think that's a good
endpoint, right?
Good note to
tip our hat to Joe
Biden. Take home and think about maybe. No, thanks so much, Erin, for coming and sharing all this work in progress. That was really cool, and for the discussion. I want to also thanks for the audience, for the people in the team who for this discussion. This is always really yeah, exciting to have this, not just the presentation. So thanks for your presentation. So thanks for joining in, for coming. Thanks for the tech support to Emerald and Jana. I want to mention again the wiki workshop for people that joined later that we are organizing, or I'm not organizing, colleagues from the team are organizing, especially Miriam is spending a lot of time with organizing the wiki workshop that is happening as part of the web conference at the end of April. The deadline for the archival submission is January 29. So if you have exciting research, please submit. We're excited to have your work there that you could present. And with this, have a good rest of your day or morning or evening, and hopefully see you around at the next research showcase in February. Bye-bye.